hopefully you have clicked the link on the previous slide and you are looking at the same rubric that I'm looking at. Before we get into the more nitty-gritty parts of this rubric, get into the details, I wanted to give you a quick overview because there's a lot of information and a lot of stuff going on in this rubric. So let's just ease into it by looking at the macro structures of the rubric before we start getting into the details and things. So you will notice that there are 5 BCAIP teaching practices represented in this rubric. We have number 1, frame instruction around students and central disciplinary ideas. We have number 2, starting here. Number 3, starting here. Number 4. And number 5. Those are 5 practices. And then we're currently working on, so this is in development, our translanguaging checklist. So this is something that we're developing to help people who are using the rubric to score observations, identify translanguaging practices on the fly. And we have this because translanguaging practices might be a new sort of area for our observers. They're new for some of us on the planning team for sure. This translanguaging is a really key part of our rubric, especially when you start getting up into the higher levels of the practices. So we'll get into that later, but this is just something to help you identify translanguaging practices in your observations. And then we have practice inhibitors here as well. And so you'll notice that there's not levels, they're not practices, they're things that we want you to be able to notice and have language to be able to keep track of these as evidence in your observations, kind of similar to the translanguaging checklist. You'll see when we get into the different more detailed parts of the rubric that there are times when we might say you might notice a practice inhibitor, or we'd like you to take note of any practice inhibitors. So keep an eye out for practice inhibitors. So these are things like we might have a minor inhibitor or a major inhibitor. A minor inhibitor might be some evidence of deficit views, negative stereotypes, or microaggressions towards emergent and proficient bilinguals that appear to inhibit their learning and biliteracy development. Compare that to a major practice inhibitor, evidence of multiple and or sustained deficit-oriented views, negative stereotypes, and or microaggressions that severely inhibit their learning and biliteracy development. So these might be, a minor one might be something really small. So an example of a practice inhibitor that I've noticed in my own observations would be like when a student maybe shared an example of something from their home life during a conversation about predator-prey. They might say, oh, like, my cat killed a mouse the other day. And that's a perfect example of a student bringing in a natural phenomena that they observed in their own life that perfectly maps onto a conversation around predator and prey concepts in a science class, right? But rather than leveraging that piece of information, that experience, the teacher sent the student away for being disruptive. So that is an example of a minor inhibitor where it's like, okay, think about what that student's going to take away from that experience. That sharing information from their home lives is bad and might get them in trouble. So something that could definitely inhibit their learning. A major practice inhibitor, we don't expect to see really any of these things in practice, but if you do see something that fits in this category, then we definitely want to be able to take a note of it, right? And sort of be able to talk about what that means for their score later on. So these are the main components, the main macro structures of this rubric. Sorry, close your eyes. I'm going to scroll back up to the top. Okay, so here we are back at the top. So now I want to get into the more meso level structures, okay? So you can see for each practice, here we are back at practice 1. We have 2 main components. So we have A, opportunities, and B, supports. So every practice has 2 components, opportunities and supports. And you're going to assign a score for each of these components for each practice. So when you're scoring, you're actually going to have 10 scores total, or 5 pairs of scores. And then for each component, let me see if I can zoom out a little bit. Nope. There are 4 levels. So here are our levels. We have no evidence of the practice, which would be a 0. Evidence that the teacher is making sort of an initial emerging attempt at using the practice, which would be a 1. Supporting, this is where the teacher is using the practice to leverage students' kind of existing knowledge or existing abilities, and that would be a level 2. And then sustaining is where the teacher is really using the practice to its maximum impact. And to get to a level 3, we're usually going to need to see some kind of biliteracy or translanguaging component as well. But again, that's getting into the more micro details. And then for each practice, we also have a series of definitions and look-fors. So this is just like an add-on to the rubric to help you know what we're talking about, right? When we get into the details of the different levels for each practice, there are going to be words that we want to make sure we're all on the same page about what that word means. And then there's also going to be some information here about how you should go about making your decision. We want to have really unified decision making across all our different scorers, right? So you are one person on the project. You are going to be doing a series of observations, and we need to make sure that you and everyone else on the project doing observations are scoring the same way, because the data that we collect becomes invalidated the more variability there is between scores. So we want to make sure we're all super on the same page with what these words mean, how to go about decision making, and which, Okay, so I think we'll get, okay, no. Actually, so we're going to save the more micro levels of talking about this rubric for the next modules. Okay, so we'll go in the next modules, we'll go through each practice one at a time, and we'll talk through what each level of each practice really means, how to distinguish between the practices, and what they look like. We're going to watch some videos as well, and you'll do some practice scoring too. So that's it for your macro and meso level overview of the structures of this rubric.